Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Life-Changing True Stories. Today, I bring you a story that reminds us that sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who help us grow into our strongest selves. It's a story about resilience, pride, humility, and the unpredictable ways life turns a moment of anger into the spark of transformation. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let me take you inside the world of Clara Hayes and Ethan Drake. A world of high ceilings, higher expectations, and one cup of coffee that changed everything. The morning sun had barely climbed over the glass towers of downtown Manhattan when Clara stepped off the elevator onto the 39th floor of Drake International Holdings. She carried herself with quiet poise, the kind of grace born not from privilege but from hard-earned discipline. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, her navy blue blazer pressed to perfection, and in one hand she held her tablet loaded with presentation notes. In the other, 2 cups of steaming cappuccino from the little cafe down the street. One for herself, one for him, Ethan Drake. 35 years old, self-made billionaire, and the man whose ambition had built an empire from a bankrupt shipping company into a global logistics powerhouse. To the world, he was a visionary. To those who worked under him, he was something else entirely. Brilliant, ruthless, exacting to the point of cruelty. But Clara had endured worse. She had grown up in a small coastal town, the daughter of a fisherman who believed in earning every grain of success through sweat and sacrifice. So when she landed the job as Ethan Drake's executive assistant 3 years ago, she made a silent promise. She would become indispensable no matter what it took. That morning, she approached the boardroom doors where Ethan and the European investors were already gathered. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she pushed the glass door open, smiling politely at the guests while setting the coffee tray beside the table. Ethan stood at the head of the long, sleek table, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light in sharp lines. His dark eyes flicked toward her with the faintest acknowledgement. Not warmth, not kindness, just acknowledgement. Clara had long stopped expecting more. The meeting had barely begun when Ethan's tone cut through the air, sharp, focused, and demanding precision from everyone in the room. The conversation flowed in numbers and strategies, projections and margins until it hit an unexpected snag. Ethan's hand paused mid-air over the projector remote. His gaze narrowed at the presentation slide on the screen. "Stop," he said, his voice like ice. "The figures for Q4 don't match the audit report." All eyes turned toward Clara. For a fraction of a second, her mind blanked. Then she opened the tablet in her hand, flipping through the files with practiced efficiency. And there it was, in a simple numerical formatting issue. A 0 misplaced in the data, a visual error, not a factual one, but to Ethan Drake, mistakes weren't measured by magnitude. They were personal offenses. "Mr. Drake," she began softly, "that's a display formatting issue. The underlying data is accurate and He cut her off before she could finish. "Unacceptable," he said coldly. "We're discussing a billion-dollar expansion, Clara. Do you understand what that means? Precision isn't optional." The investors shifted uneasily in their seats as the silence thickened around them. Ethan didn't shout. He never needed to. His quiet, razor-sharp disapproval was worse than any raised voice. "I'll expect corrected materials on my desk in 1 hour," he added before resuming the presentation as though she'd ceased to exist. When the meeting ended, and the investors offered polite handshakes and hollow smiles, Clara stood alone by the coffee tray. Her face burned, her hands trembling as she gathered the cups. 3 years of devotion, staying late, fixing his last-minute crises, managing his impossible schedule, and yet one tiny error erased it all. She had endured countless long nights rewriting his speeches, arranging his travel, smoothing over his temper, and never once had he thanked her. But today felt different. Something inside her had cracked. By the time she reached his office, her pulse was pounding. Ethan sat behind his massive glass desk, reviewing papers as if the confrontation in the conference room had been nothing. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice controlled but taut. Without looking up, he said, "Close the door." The click of the latch echoed through the quiet office. "Clara," he began, "you've been with me long enough to know that I don't tolerate carelessness." That was it. The last thread of restraint snapped. "Carelessness?" she repeated, incredulous. "That's what you think this is?" A minor visual error during a presentation I prepared in 72 hours straight while you were changing direction every 5 minutes. Ethan's head lifted, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. Watch your tone, he said softly. No, she snapped, surprising even herself. I've watched my tone for 3 years. I've watched my health, my time, my life slip away trying to meet impossible expectations. And I'm done pretending that you're some flawless genius whose time is worth more than anyone else's. She took a step closer, her voice trembling now not with fear but with fury. You treat people like machines, and maybe that's why you've never learned how to work with human beings. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then, as calm as ever, he murmured, If you're finished venting, perhaps we can get back to professionalism. That calmness, that arrogant, condescending calm, shattered what little control she had left. Without thinking, she lifted the coffee cup in her hand, his untouched cappuccino from the tray, and threw it straight at his chest. The cup hit with a splash, dark liquid spreading across his pristine white shirt and expensive silk tie. Time froze. Ethan stared at her in disbelief as the smell of roasted coffee filled the air. Clara's breath came fast, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The silence stretched until she could no longer bear it. I quit, she said quietly, her voice breaking. Effective immediately. She turned toward the door, ready to walk out of that office and everything it represented. But before her hand touched the handle, his voice stopped her. No, you don't. The words were calm, too calm, but there was something in them that made her turn back. Ethan stood slowly, coffee dripping from his shirt, his eyes locked on hers with a strange, unreadable intensity. You're not quitting, he said evenly. Not like this. You can't stop me, she shot back. You think you control everything, but you don't control me. He stepped closer, and though his expression remained composed, there was something new in his gaze, something raw and almost so human. You've wanted to say that for a long time, haven't you? He asked quietly. Fine, you've made your point. Now listen to mine. I've been hard on you because you're capable of more than anyone I've ever hired. You don't see it, but I do, and I'm not letting you walk away over one bad morning. She blinked, taken aback. Was this pride or manipulation? You humiliated me in front of everyone, she said bitterly. And you think a few flattering words will make it right? No, he said simply. I think results will. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick folder. I was going to assign this to my strategy director, but I'm giving it to you. It's the Vanguard partnership deal. Our biggest expansion in 5 years. You'll co-lead it with me. If you still want to resign after it's done, I'll accept it. And I'll personally recommend you to any company you want. But if you walk out now, you'll always wonder what might have happened if you stayed long enough to prove to yourself, not to me, that you were never the problem. His voice softened, but his eyes didn't waver. 1 week, Clara, that's all I'm asking. Her heart was still pounding, her mind torn between anger and disbelief. She should have walked away. She should have slammed the door, filed her resignation, and never looked back. But somewhere, buried beneath the fury, his words struck a chord she didn't want to admit. Prove it to yourself. That was the line that lingered, because deep down she knew. She didn't want to leave as the woman who threw coffee at her boss. She wanted to leave as the woman who won. Clara exhaled slowly, every muscle tense. 1 week, she said at last. After that, I'm gone. Ethan nodded once, the faintest glimmer of something, approval, maybe respect, flickering in his gaze. Deal. As she walked out of his office, the weight in her chest didn't lessen. If anything, it grew heavier. She had no idea what she'd just agreed to, or how much that one impulsive decision would change both their lives. Outside the office, the city was alive, horns blaring, sunlight bouncing off glass towers, the pulse of ambition beating in every street. Clara stopped by the elevator and caught her reflection in the mirrored doors. Coffee stains on her sleeve, eyes still blazing with adrenaline, heart still racing with confusion. She didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the story truly began. Not the mistake, not the humiliation, not even the coffee. But the decision to stay, the decision to fight, the decision that would soon reveal who Ethan Drake really was behind that unshakable armor, and who Clara Hayes was destined to become when she finally stopped living in his shadow and started standing in her own light. The next morning began long before sunrise. The city still slept under a blanket of silver mist as Clara's alarm went off at 4:45 a.m. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy ache behind her eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from everything she had carried inside her the day before. Anger, shame, defiance, and beneath it all, a strange spark of something else and curiosity. Why had he asked her to stay? What game was Ethan Drake playing? Whatever it was, she wasn't about to be his pawn. If this was her final week at Drake International, she would make it the one they never forgot. By 6 a.m., she was at the office. The 39th floor glowed in the cold light of dawn, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. She expected to find the place empty, but Ethan was already there. He stood by the panoramic window, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the city like a general surveying his battlefield. His tie was loose, a cup of black coffee in hand. It was strange to see him like that. Not the immaculate, untouchable executive, but a man who looked as though sleep had been optional for a very long time. "You're early," he said without turning. His tone wasn't sharp this time, just factual. "So are you," she replied, walking past him to the conference table where stacks of documents awaited. "You said we're co-leading this deal, so I assumed that meant preparation, not power games." That earned the faintest hint of amusement from him, a ghost of a smile that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. "Good," he said simply, "because we don't have time for either." They spent the morning dissecting the Vanguard partnership, a billion-dollar logistics merger that could double the company's global reach or destroy its reputation if it failed. Clara reviewed the financials, her fingers flying over the keyboard, while Ethan paced, reciting figures from memory, analyzing market risks with unnerving precision. He was infuriatingly sharp, his mind moving faster than most people could follow. But for the first time, he wasn't using that brilliance as a weapon. When she challenged him, he listened. When she disagreed, he didn't shut her down. He debated, tested her reasoning, and once, when she presented a better solution, he nodded and simply said, "Good call." That small acknowledgement hit her harder than she expected. After years of criticism, those two words felt like sunlight after endless rain. As the hours stretched into afternoon, something unfamiliar settled between them, an uneasy respect. They spoke less like boss and employee, and more like equals navigating uncharted ground. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was thoughtful, focused, and for Clara, dangerously confusing. She had spent 3 years resenting him, convinced that behind his polished surface was nothing but ego and ice. But now, as she watched him run his hand through his hair, fatigue softening the edges of his usual composure, she began to see traces of something human, something she hadn't expected to find in Ethan Drake. They took a break around noon. Ethan ordered lunch in, nothing fancy, just sandwiches and bottled water from the corner deli. The simplicity of it caught Clara off guard. She had expected him to demand something imported and extravagant, but he ate the same turkey sandwich she did, sitting at the table with his sleeves still rolled, tie forgotten on the chair beside him. For a few quiet minutes, they simply existed in the same space, two exhausted people trying to hold their ambitions together. "Why did you make me stay?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been burning inside her since yesterday. He looked up from his notes, meeting her gaze directly. "Because you're the only one here who tells me the truth," he said. "Everyone else tells me what they think I want to hear." Clara frowned, taken aback by the honesty in his tone. "And what makes you think I'll do that now?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because you've already thrown coffee at me. There's not much further you can go down that road." For the first time in months, Clara laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that startled even her. Ethan's expression softened at the sound, and for a fleeting moment, he looked like someone else entirely, not the billionaire whose name commanded fear, but a man who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. But as quickly as the warmth appeared, it vanished behind the familiar wall of control. "We have 6 days left," he said, standing abruptly. "Let's make them count." That night, Clara stayed in the office long after most of the building had gone dark. The city glowed below like a living circuit board, streets pulsing with light and motion. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, reviewing the projections one last time. She didn't hear him approach until he set a cup of tea on the desk beside her. "You've been at it for hours," Ethan said quietly. "Go home, Clara." "I will," she murmured, not looking up. "Just finishing this section." Perfectionist, he said under his breath. She gave a small smile. Says the man who rewrites entire contracts because of a missing comma. He didn't deny it. Fair point, he said, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two perfectionists who had spent years at war and somehow found a strange peace in shared exhaustion. Over the next few days, they worked side by side like soldiers in a silent campaign. Ethan's intensity was relentless, but Clara matched it hour for hour. They reviewed projections, negotiated investor calls, and rewrote proposals until the early hours of the morning. Somewhere along the way, the hostility between them melted into something more complex. Respect, admiration, maybe even understanding. Ethan stopped ordering her around and started asking for her opinion. When she spoke, he listened with an attentiveness that made her heartbeat quicken for reasons she didn't want to analyze. But beneath the progress, something darker simmered. Late one evening, Clara overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. Ethan was in his office, voice low but tense. "No, I can't delay it," he said sharply. "If the Vanguard deal collapses, we lose half the board's confidence. I'll handle it, just keep it quiet." His tone was steel, but when he hung up, the look in his eyes wasn't arrogance. It was worry. Genuine, unguarded worry. For the first time, she realized that Ethan Drake's empire wasn't as unshakable as it appeared. He wasn't just fighting for expansion, he was fighting for survival. The next morning, she confronted him. "How bad is it?" she asked simply. He looked up from his desk, momentarily startled. "Excuse me?" "The company," she said, her tone steady. "I heard your call last night. You said the board would lose confidence if the deal fell through." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have heard that. But I did. So tell me the truth." For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "We're stretched thin," he admitted quietly. 3 expansions in 18 months, debt leveraged to the limit, supply chain delays in Asia. If this deal fails, it won't sink us completely, but it'll leave us bleeding for years. Clara studied him, realizing in that moment how much of his coldness was armor, a defense against the crushing weight of what he carried. "So all this pressure," she said softly. "It's not about ego. It's about survival." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Maybe they're the same thing," he said. That night, Clara stayed later than ever. But this time, she wasn't staying because she had to. She stayed because she wanted to. Because for the first time in 3 years, she saw the man behind the mask. Flawed, lonely, driven by a desperation not to fail the empire he'd built with his own hands. And maybe, just maybe, she understood him more than she wanted to admit. They worked in silence, their desks lit only by the glow of the city beyond the glass. 2 people who had spent years misunderstanding each other, now finding an unspoken rhythm that felt almost like trust. When dawn finally broke, casting pale gold light over the skyline, Ethan looked up from his notes and said quietly, "You're not what I thought you were." Clara smiled faintly. "Neither are you." He watched her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. "Then maybe," he said softly, "this week isn't about proving anything. Maybe it's about seeing what we've both been too blind to notice." And with that, he returned to his work. But the air between them was no longer cold. It was charged, alive with the silent electricity of 2 people standing on the edge of change. The deal was still uncertain. The week was only halfway through, but somewhere in the long hours and sleepless nights, the walls they had built began to crack. And through those cracks, something new was starting to bloom. Not love yet, not trust, but perhaps the fragile beginnings of both. The morning began with a sharp wind and gray skies pressing against the towering glass walls of the city. The mood inside the Drake International boardroom matched the weather, cold, tense, uncertain. The Vanguard partnership presentation was scheduled for that afternoon, and the pressure had become almost unbearable. Clara could feel it in the air, the way conversations fell into hushed tones, the way analysts avoided eye contact when she passed. For the first time since the merger talks began, whispers of failure had begun circulating through the corridors. Whispers that the great Ethan Drake was losing control of his empire. Clara entered. Ethan's office carrying 2 mugs of black coffee, his preferred dose of fuel. He stood by the window, jaw tight, phone pressed to his ear. "No," he said flatly, his tone cold but his eyes distant. "Tell them the shipment delay doesn't change our financial stability. We are not revising our projections. End of discussion. When he hung up, his expression was carved in stone. She placed the coffee on his desk, watching him silently for a moment before saying, "You can't keep fighting fires with pride, Ethan." He looked up sharply, almost startled by the use of his first name. She hadn't realized she'd said it aloud. "Excuse me?" he asked. "You heard me," she replied, steady but calm. "You keep trying to hold everything together by sheer will, but willpower isn't strategy. You need to be transparent with them, the investors, the board, even the employees. People trust leaders who tell the truth, not ones who pretend everything is fine." He stared at her, and for a long time he didn't respond. Then he sighed, running a hand across his face. "You think honesty will calm a room full of billion-dollar shareholders?" "I think pretending will destroy you faster," she said simply. "You hired people who follow your vision, not your silence." There was a pause, a long, heavy one, before he gave a small nod. "Then help me tell the truth," he said quietly. "If I do this, I do it with you standing beside me." The simplicity of that statement struck her. He wasn't demanding obedience anymore. He was asking for partnership. That subtle shift, from command to collaboration, meant more to Clara than any apology ever could. The hours that followed passed in a blur of preparation. They restructured the presentation, cutting out the glossy projections and replacing them with transparent data and actionable recovery plans. Clara took charge of the communication draft, rewriting it in her calm, clear tone that humanized the company's numbers. Ethan reviewed every line but made fewer corrections than usual. When he finally leaned back in his chair, scanning the final version, he said softly, "This sounds like something real people can believe in." She smiled faintly. "That's the idea." By late afternoon, the boardroom filled with the polished faces of executives and investors, each armed with questions sharp enough to slice through pride. Ethan entered first, composed and commanding as always, but Clara noticed the faint tension in his shoulders. She stood beside him, her tablet ready, her notes precise, but her heartbeat betrayed her calm exterior. The meeting began, and for the first time, Ethan didn't hide behind rehearsed confidence. He spoke directly, admitting the challenges the company faced but outlining exactly how they would recover. He credited his team by name. He even, to Clara's astonishment, thanked her publicly for restructuring the communication strategy that made the plan possible. The room fell silent for a long moment. Then one of the lead investors, a gray-haired man known for his brutal honesty, leaned forward. "Mr. Drake," he said slowly, "I've known you for 8 years. I've never heard you speak this openly. It's refreshing." He glanced at Clara. "And it seems you've finally learned the value of the people who keep your empire standing." A murmur of laughter rippled through the room, easing the tension. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I'm learning," he said, and though it was brief, the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. When the meeting ended, the investors left with firm handshakes and subtle smiles. The deal wasn't finalized yet, but the tone had shifted from doubt to confidence. For the first time in weeks, hope had returned to the air. Clara lingered behind, watching Ethan gather his papers. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did it." His gaze met hers, steady and unguarded. "I should have trusted you sooner." The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any grand apology ever could. For 3 years she had waited for acknowledgement. Not flattery, not praise, just recognition that her work mattered. And now, in that quiet room, she finally received it. But peace, like success, is fragile. The following day brought news that shattered the calm. A data breach in one of the subsidiary branches had leaked confidential logistics information, threatening to derail the entire merger. The media caught wind of it within hours, and headlines spread like wildfire. Drake International facing security crisis, days before major deal. Ethan's office became a storm zone. Phones rang nonstop. Analysts scrambled to control the damage, and the calm that Clara had fought so hard to build began to collapse. She found him standing by the window again, shoulders stiff, face pale. "How bad is it?" she asked. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Bad enough that the Vanguard board might withdraw. They think we're unstable." Clara felt the chill settle in her stomach. "Then we fight harder," she said firmly. "We show them that resilience isn't just a word in our brochure." He looked at her, and for a moment his composure broke. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "If this deal falls, it's not just numbers. It's thousands of employees, their families, the legacy I built from nothing. Everything I've worked for dies." His hands trembled as he spoke, the mask finally slipping. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the perfectionist, but the exhausted man who had carried too much for too long. Without thinking, she stepped closer, her voice softer now. "Then let me carry some of it," she said. "You don't have to fight alone." Those words, simple, human, uncalculated, hung in the air between them like a lifeline. Ethan's eyes met hers, raw and uncertain, and for a brief moment the walls between them disappeared. They spent the next 48 hours in relentless crisis management, barely sleeping, working side by side through the chaos. Clara coordinated with cybersecurity teams, drafted press statements, and personally reached out to affected partners. Ethan handled the board, fielding accusations with measured authority. At one point, when the pressure became unbearable, she found him sitting in the darkened conference room, head in his hands. She entered quietly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You built this company once," she said softly. "You can do it again, but this time you don't have to do it alone." He looked up at her, eyes rimmed with exhaustion but glimmering with gratitude. "You have no idea how much that means," he murmured. "Then let me prove it," she replied, and returned to work. By the end of the week, against all odds, the situation began to stabilize. The breach had been contained, the investors reassured, and the Vanguard partnership was back on track. When the final confirmation came through, a signed agreement, sealed and approved, Ethan walked into Clara's office without a word, holding the document in his hand. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as if searching for something to say but unable to find it. Then quietly he placed the folder on her desk. "We did it," he said. "You saved us," Clara shook her head. "No," she said gently. "We saved each other." He smiled faintly, the first true smile she had ever seen from him. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe you were never meant to work beneath me. Maybe you were meant to stand beside me." There was warmth in his eyes now, a kind of respect that reached beyond professionalism. It wasn't romantic yet, not truly, but it carried the first faint pulse of something deeper, something both of them were too afraid to name. As evening fell, they stood together by the window, the city lights stretching endlessly before them. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In that quiet moment, they both understood what the past week had meant. Not just a business victory, but a personal awakening. Ethan had learned humility. Clara had found her voice. And together they had learned that strength doesn't always come from standing alone. Sometimes, it comes from the courage to let someone stand beside you. What neither of them knew then was that this victory, as powerful as it was only the beginning. Because when people who once stood on opposite sides of pride begin to understand each other, something extraordinary begins to bloom. And sometimes it changes everything. The Monday after the deal closed felt different. The halls of Drake International buzzed with renewed confidence. Laughter echoed where tension once reigned. Employees greeted each other with a sense of relief that only comes after surviving a storm. For the first time in years, Ethan's name wasn't whispered with fear, but spoken with respect. The media hailed him as the man who turned crisis into opportunity. Yet behind his steady posture and crisp suits, Clara saw something shifting, something quieter than applause. He seemed lighter, almost human, and that perhaps unsettled her more than his old arrogance ever did. She returned to her desk that morning to find a single envelope resting on the keyboard. No company logo, no instructions, just her name handwritten in bold black ink. Inside was a short note in Ethan's handwriting. "You were right. Strength isn't silence. Thank you for reminding me how to listen." At the bottom was a postscript: "Dinner tonight, 8 p.m., my treat. No work talk." For several minutes she simply stared at the paper, unsure whether to smile or run. She had spent the last week rebuilding his trust and, unexpectedly, her own confidence. The idea of sitting across from him outside the boundaries of schedules and spreadsheets felt dangerous. But curiosity has a way of outweighing caution, and by 8 that evening, she found herself standing in front of a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the glittering skyline. Ethan was already there, waiting near the glass railing, the city lights painting faint reflections across his face. He turned when he heard her approach, and for the first time she noticed he wasn't wearing his usual armor of perfection. No tie, no cold posture. Just a man, simply dressed, eyes steady and open. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't," she admitted. "I wasn't sure if this was dinner or another negotiation. Maybe both," he said with a small smile. "But this time, the stakes are different." They sat beneath strings of warm lights that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The conversation began cautiously, circling around neutral topics: the city, travel, even a few harmless jokes about office politics. But as the night deepened, so did the honesty between them. Ethan spoke of his childhood, of the years before success when his family struggled to keep their business alive. "I grew up watching everything crumble," he said quietly, staring at the skyline. "When I finally rebuilt it, I swore I'd never let anything slip again. That's why I became like that, demanding, hard, maybe too hard." Clara listened, her heart softening with every word. "Perfection is a shield," she said gently. "You think it keeps you safe, but all it does is keep people out." He looked at her then, really looked, and the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. "You see me too clearly," he murmured. "It's unsettling." "Maybe that's what you needed," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The waiter refilled their glasses and left them in the hush of the night. For a long time, neither spoke. The city hummed below, but up there, time seemed to stand still. Then Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone low and sincere. "You changed this place, Clara, not just the company, me. I didn't think anyone could." She smiled faintly, fighting the warmth rising to her cheeks. "Maybe you just needed someone who wasn't afraid to throw coffee at you." That drew a rare laugh from him, real, unguarded, and almost boyish. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh without restraint. And in that sound she heard the truth. The man she had once despised was still learning how to be human. After dinner, they walked along the rooftop edge, a gentle wind brushing past them. Ethan paused near the railing and said, "The week's over. You could walk away now, start fresh anywhere. Every major firm would take you in a heartbeat. But I won't pretend I don't hope you'll stay." Clara turned toward him, her heart caught between reason and instinct. "I haven't decided yet," she said honestly. "But I will." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then whatever you choose, I'll respect it." It should have ended there, with professionalism intact and feelings neatly contained. But life rarely follows neat lines. Over the next few weeks, their connection grew in ways neither had intended. Working together no longer felt like obligation. It felt like partnership. He began trusting her with decisions once reserved for the board. She began to see the man behind the title, the one who stayed late not out of vanity but because he feared failure more than fatigue. And sometimes, late at night, when the office lights dimmed and their laughter replaced the hum of machines, she caught herself wondering when admiration had turned into something softer, something dangerous. The turning point came unexpectedly on a rainy Friday evening. The storm outside raged against the windows while the two of them reviewed a new project proposal. Power flickered once, twice, and then the building went dark, leaving only the emergency lights casting an amber glow across the room. Clara sighed, rubbing her temples. "Perfect. Just when we were getting somewhere." Ethan chuckled quietly. "Maybe it's the universe telling us to stop working for once." They stood by the window, watching lightning split the clouds over the skyline. "You know," she said softly, "when I first started here, I thought you were the coldest man alive." "I was," he said simply, "until you reminded me I didn't have to be." The honesty in his tone made her heart stumble. "You don't have to say things like that," she whispered. "I'm not saying it for effect," he replied. "I'm saying it because it's true." Something in the way he looked at her in that half-light, unshielded, uncertain, but utterly sincere, made the space between them feel impossibly small. For one fragile moment, it seemed inevitable that the silence would break into something neither of them could undo, but instead Ethan stepped back, exhaling slowly. "You should get home before the storm gets worse," he said quietly. Clara nodded, though part of her wished he hadn't said it. As she walked toward the elevator, he added, "Thank you for staying when you could have left." She turned, meeting his gaze across the dim hallway. "Maybe I stayed because I saw something worth saving," she said softly. When the elevator doors closed, Ethan stood motionless, the echo of her words lingering in the quiet. For the first time in years, he realized that success hadn't been what kept him alive. It was connection. And maybe, just maybe, that connection had a name. Days turned into weeks, and whispers began to spread through the company, harmless speculation about the closeness between the CEO and his brilliant assistant. Neither addressed it, but both felt the tension growing like an unspoken confession. Then, during a quarterly conference in Chicago, the rumor reached the wrong ears. A rival executive hinted that Clara had only risen because of Ethan's favoritism. The accusation was casual but cutting, and it spread fast. When she heard it, Clara felt the same familiar sting she had tried so hard to escape, the pain of being seen as less than what she'd earned. That night, in her hotel room, she confronted Ethan. "Do you know what they're saying?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "They think I'm here because of you, not because of my work." He looked stunned. "Clara, no, that's not—" "It doesn't matter what's true," she cut in. "What matters is that it looks true. Everything I've fought for, every late night, every sacrifice, it's all being erased by one assumption." Ethan's expression darkened, not with anger toward her, but with himself. "I'll fix it," he said immediately. "I'll make a statement." "No," she said firmly. "Don't you dare. If you defend me, it'll only make it worse. I have to handle this my way," and she did. The next day, she took the stage during the final session of the conference and delivered a presentation so sharp, so commanding, that the room fell silent. Every projection, every argument, every fact she delivered with such authority that even her detractors could only applaud. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She didn't look for Ethan, but she felt his gaze on her from across the room, pride and awe written plain on his face. That night, as they rode the elevator back to their rooms, Ethan finally spoke. "You didn't just silence them," he said quietly. "You reminded me why I needed you from the start." Clara smiled faintly, exhaustion softening her expression. "You never needed me, Ethan. You just needed to believe in someone other than yourself." He looked at her then, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full. "Maybe I believe now," he said softly, and in that small space, between exhaustion and honesty, between ambition and something dangerously close to affection, both of them realized that whatever this was, it was no longer just about work. It was about redemption, about trust, about two people who had found light in the very place where both had been broken before. The morning after the Chicago conference, Clara woke before dawn, the hotel room bathed in the faint amber glow of the city, still half asleep. She sat by the window, coffee cooling untouched beside her, watching the lights fade into daylight. The applause from yesterday still echoed faintly in her memory, but instead of satisfaction, she felt a deep, quiet ache. She had fought for respect and she had won it, but the victory felt strangely heavy. Somewhere along the way, the lines between duty and emotion, partnership and affection had blurred. She had seen a different side of Ethan Drake, a man who had learned to listen, to trust, to care, and yet, the same strength that had carried her this far now whispered that it was time to step away while she still knew who she was. By the time she reached the lobby, Ethan was already there, waiting. The exhaustion of the past weeks showed faintly around his eyes, but there was also a softness that hadn't existed before, a quiet humility that made him seem more human than the legend the world knew. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you," she replied. He smiled faintly. "I suppose victory doesn't rest easy." She hesitated before answering. "It's not victory I'm thinking about." They walked together to the car that would take them to the airport. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, the sky painted in shades of silver and blue. For a while, neither spoke. Then Clara broke the silence. "Ethan, when we get back to New York, I need to talk to you about something." He turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That sounds ominous." She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Not ominous, just honest." The ride back felt longer than it should have. When they reached the office later that afternoon, congratulations poured in from every direction. Employees clapped in the halls, executives offered handshakes, and the company's internal newsletter declared Drake International reborn. Through it all, Ethan accepted the praise with his usual composure, but his eyes searched for her more than once, and each time he found her already watching him. the distance between them full of words neither dared to speak. That evening, when the building emptied and the city lights glowed against the glass walls, Clara entered his office one last time. Ethan looked up from his desk, sensing the gravity in her presence. "You're leaving," he said quietly, not as a question but as a truth already known. She nodded slowly. "I am." He leaned back, exhaling softly. "Because of the rumors?" "Because of me?" "Because of me," she said gently. "I need to know who I am outside of this place. I came here to prove myself, and I did. But if I stay, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering whether I'm here because of what I can do, or because of what you see in me." He rose from his chair and crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away. "Clara, you built half of what this company has become. I can't imagine this place without you." She met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly why I have to go. You taught me how to fight, how to lead, but now I need to learn how to begin again on my own terms." The silence that followed was thick with everything unspoken: admiration, regret, affection. Finally, Ethan nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "Then I won't stop you this time. But I will say this, you were never my assistant. You were the compass that brought me back to being human." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. "Then I guess we both did what we were supposed to." She reached out her hand, and when he took it, the handshake lingered. Professional, yes, but layered with the weight of everything they had survived. When she turned to leave, he said softly, "Wherever you go, Clara, they'll be lucky to have you." She looked back once, smiled faintly, and said, "Maybe luck has nothing to do with it anymore." The next weeks passed like the slow turning of a season. Clara accepted an offer from a sustainable energy startup across the city, a small company with vision and chaos in equal measure. She threw herself into the challenge, guiding teams, shaping culture, and finding joy again in creation rather than correction. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the office was quiet and the hum of the city filled the background, she caught herself thinking of the view from the 39th floor, the skyline reflected in glass, and the man who had once stood beside her, equally flawed and formidable. Ethan Drake, for his part, surprised everyone. Without Clara, many expected the company to falter again. Instead, he led with a different kind of power, steady, transparent, collaborative. The ruthless edge had softened into something wiser. At board meetings, he credited his team by name. In interviews, he spoke less about domination and more about vision. And when reporters asked what had changed him, he gave a simple, honest answer. "A woman who reminded me that leadership isn't about control, it's about courage." 6 months later, their paths crossed again at an international leadership summit. Clara was there representing her new company. Ethan was a keynote speaker. The event was held in a grand hall filled with lights, cameras, and the low murmur of ambition. When she saw him step onto the stage, immaculate as always yet somehow more grounded, she felt an unexpected calm. He spoke not about profit margins or market takeovers, but about growth, integrity, and the power of second chances. His final words hung in the air like a confession. "No empire stands because of one person's brilliance," he said. "It stands because someone somewhere reminded you that you could be better." The audience applauded, but his eyes found hers across the crowd. For a moment the noise faded. When the session ended, he walked toward her, smiling with quiet recognition. "You're still rewriting the rules, I see," he said. "You taught me well," she replied. They stepped aside into the quiet of the hallway, where the world outside blurred into motion and memory. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again," he admitted. "I wasn't sure I wanted to," she said truthfully, then added, "but I'm glad I did." He studied her face for a long moment. "You seem happy." "I am," she said. "Happier than I thought I'd be." "Then I won't ruin that," he said softly. "But I need to say something before you go." She waited, heart steady but curious. "When you walked away, I thought I'd lost the most capable partner I ever had. I didn't realize I'd lost something more. The person who reminded me what it means to care. So thank you, Clara, for everything, for the coffee, for the chaos, for teaching me that perfection isn't the goal, growth is." Clara smiled gently, the ache in her chest replaced by something peaceful. "And thank you," she said, "for teaching me that strength doesn't mean doing everything alone." They stood there for a moment, Two lives that had once collided so violently now finding balance in mutual respect. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic goodbye, just the quiet understanding that what they had shared had already changed them forever. As they parted, Ethan reached into his pocket and handed her a folded slip of paper. "It's not a contract," he said with a faint smile. "Just a reminder." When she unfolded it later, she found only 6 words written in his familiar hand. "Keep building, this time for yourself." Years later, when Clara Hayes became the CEO of her own company, she kept that note framed on her desk. Visitors often asked about it, assuming it was some corporate motto. She never explained. But sometimes on quiet evenings when the city lights mirrored the same skyline she once stared at from the 39th floor, she would smile and whisper a silent thank you to the man who had once taught her that failure is just another word for beginning. And somewhere across the city, in an office that still bore her touch, the careful organization, the soft light, the faint scent of coffee, Ethan Drake would glance at his own framed memory. A photograph of a presentation slide from years ago, the one with the decimal error that started it all. Beneath it, in her handwriting, were the words she once said to him: "Maybe your expectations aren't the problem, but maybe they're not the answer either." He would smile then, not with regret, but with pride. Because sometimes the people who challenge you the hardest are the ones who set you free. And that, my beautiful family, is the truth hidden behind this story. The idea that every ending is a doorway, every conflict a mirror, and every moment of doubt a quiet invitation to grow. Whether it's in love, work, or life itself, the strength we search for isn't found in perfection or power. It's found in the courage to listen, to change, and to begin again.